The webinar will begin in 1 minute. Welcome, everyone. We are pleased that you have joined us for today's webinar titled Truthing the Stretch. The webinar will last approximately 20 minutes, and at the end, you will be given an opportunity to receive supporting materials by email free of charge to you. You will also be told how you may email questions related to today's content to the presenter. Today's presenter will be Linus Sugis. Linus is the president of Advanced Underwriting Consultants. He and his team answer tax and technical questions posed by producers every day. Linus also spent 14 years working in the home office of a life insurance company in various roles. He also started, ran, and sold an estate planning law practice in the Nashville area. Linus will draw on his legal and life insurance experience during today's webinar, and here he is.
Thank you very much, Amber, and welcome everybody. We're going to discuss truthing the stretch here in a little bit. It's going to be a crash course in the stretch rules, and we're going to do our best to limit the webinar to 20 minutes. Before we get involved in that, let me remind you that we have this free webinar on the first Wednesday of every month. It is open to financial professionals, life insurance professionals. The one for September is titled Using UTMA and will be held, as I mentioned, on the first Wednesday at 11 a.m. the same time. You can find an archive of our sessions on our YouTube channel. Before we get started on truthing the stretch, let's go ahead and decide what it is that we will talk about in October. Your three choices are, first of all, late premium dooms by self-funding. The second choice is Stoli Gets Spicy. And the third choice is an update on Aretha Franklin's estate. I am going to go ahead and launch the poll and ask for you to cast your vote for what it is that you would like to hear about in October. The poll's open. Please go ahead and cast your votes. Give you a few more seconds. Not everybody's voted yet. I am going to go ahead and close the poll. And what we'll talk about in October is late premium dooms by self-funding. Thank you for voting, and thank you for supporting our webinars. So let's go ahead and let's talk about truthing the stretch. There are lots of rules with regard to stretch, and it's easy to get confused about them. And my hope is that it will be slightly less confusing as a result of today's webinar, but feel welcome to ask for the materials by emailing later on. Amber will give you the information about that. There are stretch rules for pre-Secure Act qualified accounts. There are stretch rules that are effective for deaths that occur in 2020 or later. Those are post-secure stretch rules for qualified accounts. There are different stretch rules for non-inherited, non-qualified deferred annuities. And there are special stretch rules for twice inherited qualified accounts and non-qualified annuities. And all of those things are things that we get asked about all the time. There's a lot of confusion about that. So we're going to go over each of them in turn quickly. So let's talk first of all about what the Pre-Secure Act rules are for qualified accounts. These are qualified accounts like IRAs or employer-sponsored accounts. One of the key things that needs to be sorted out is whether or not the account owner died before or after the date at which RMDs needed to begin. That's sometimes referred to as the RBD, required beginning date. The required beginning date is generally April 1st of the year after the account owner reached the RMD age. April 1st of the calendar year after. That's the deadline for taking the first RMD. If the death occurred prior to the required beginning date, there's one set of rules, and if the death occurred after the required beginning date, there's a different set of rules. And so let's talk about surviving spouse first under the old Pre-Secure Act rules. If surviving spouse was the beneficiary, she could decide to treat the inherited, let's call it an IRA, treat the inherited IRA as her own, or she could decide to stretch based on life expectancy, beginning with the year that the decedent would have turned RMD age. And so that's what surviving spouse could do with regard to an inherited qualified account if death occurred for the account owner prior to the required beginning date. Now, a non-spouse beneficiary had two choices. Choice number one would be to not do anything except completely liquidate the inherited qualified account no later than the end of the 5th year after the owner's death. Or the non-spouse beneficiary could stretch based on life expectancy, beginning with the year after, the calendar year after the original owner's death. So those are the choices that were available under the old rules if death occurred prior to the required beginning date. Where death occurred after the required beginning date, the surviving spouse could still elect to treat the inherited qualified account as her own, or the surviving spouse could stretch based on life expectancy beginning in the year after the original owner's death. A non-spouse could stretch based on life expectancy beginning with the year after death. The difference about a post required beginning date or a pre-required beginning date stretch under the old rules for a non-spouse is that if death occurred prior to the required beginning date, 5-year liquidation was an option. If death occurs after the required beginning date, the 5-year option is off the table. And so the only option for a non-spouse beneficiary is to stretch based on life expectancy. So those are the old rules. And so let's touch briefly on trusts or estates that are beneficiaries. If we've got a situation where a trust or estate is acting pretty much for the exclusive benefit of the surviving spouse, then the surviving spouse could act as if she was the beneficiary, and usually that meant that 60-day rollover into the spouse's own IRA was possible. There are some private letter rulings that support that idea. If we've got a look-through trust that is not for the exclusive benefit of the surviving spouse, then we have different rules. Look-through trust is irrevocable as of the date of the account owner's death. It's valid under state law. All the beneficiaries are real people, and we can identify who all the beneficiaries are. If all of those boxes are checked, we've got a look-through trust. And generally, a look-through trust can stretch as if the oldest trust beneficiary were the named beneficiary. That doesn't mean the oldest trust beneficiary gets all the money. It means the trustee gets to stretch based on the age of the oldest trust beneficiary. And where we've got a situation where a trust is not an alter ego or look-through trust, if death occurred prior to the required beginning date, we've got 5-year liquidation. If death occurred after the required beginning date, then we would continue the decedent's RMDs as if the decedent were still alive if death occurred after the required beginning date. So those are the old rules with regard to inherited IRAs, inherited qualified accounts. So let's talk about what happened as a result of the Secure Act. And let's talk first of all, death prior to required beginning date for surviving spouse. Her options are the same. She's in a special category, or he, surviving spouse, is in a special category than other beneficiaries. There is no 10-year liquidation deadline. We've got the abilities for surviving spouse to treat the inherited account as her own or to stretch based on life expectancy starting in the year the decedent would have reached RMD age. Now, for non-spouse, there's a difference, and that is that if death occurred prior to the required beginning date, 10-year liquidation is an option rather than 5-year liquidation. No RMDs are required if the death of the original account owner was prior to the time when they needed to start RMDs. So that's the deal. So 10-year liquidation is the only option and the only requirement under those circumstances. If we have an eligible designated beneficiary, eligible designated beneficiaries are generally those who are disabled or within close in age, not much younger than the original account owner, as well as a minor child of the original account owner would be an EDB. They get to stretch based on life expectancy for as long as the impairment lasts. So if somebody stops being disabled, you get 10 years from that point to liquidate the inherited a qualified account. If you've got a minor who reaches the age of majority, which is generally age 21, they've got 10 years after reaching the age of majority to liquidate, and they would take annual RMDs based on life expectancy. So that's this whole new category of eligible designated beneficiaries. That's what they do. If death occurs after the required beginning date for the original account owner, surviving spouse again has the ability to do the same kind of stuff that she could do for under the older rules, and a non-spouse has to take annual RMDs based on life expectancy with a 10-year liquidation deadline. Those are the changes that were made as a result of the Secure Act. So what about if we've got a trust as the beneficiary? Well, of course, that makes things even more complicated. We've still got the ability, if we've got an alter ego trust or estate for the benefit of the surviving spouse, to pull off a 60-day rollover into the surviving spouse's own IRA based on what we know from the IRS's proposed regulations about the Secure Act and some of the old law with regard to alter ego trusts being the beneficiary. If we've got a look-through trust, we stretch based on we've got the same situation as if the oldest beneficiary of the trust were the beneficiary of the account. And so whether death occurred prior to the required beginning date or after the required beginning date matters for the purpose of figuring out what stretch options the trustee has. And where we've got a situation where a trust or estate is neither an alter ego trust nor a look-through trust, we've got 5-year liquidation if death occurred prior to the required beginning date. And we've got annual RMD obligation if death occurred after the required beginning date, but it can't last longer than 5 years. Apparently that's the rule with regard to post-secure stretch, where an estate or a non-look-through trust is the beneficiary of the account. I know it's complicated. You can't make this stuff up. That's what Congress and the President and the IRS have gotten together to decide. So that's Secure Act. Let's talk about non-qualified annuities. Non-qualified annuity stretch rules were not changed as a result of the Secure Act. We often get questions about this. It's important to stress. Non-qualified annuity stretch rules did not change as a result of the Secure Act. And so what does that mean? That means that if we've got a surviving spouse beneficiary of a non-qualified annuity, just like she could under old rules, the old rules are still the new rules. She gets to treat the inherited NQDA as her own, or if she so chooses, she can stretch based on her life expectancy beginning with the year after the account owner's death. I don't know of any circumstances where surviving spouse has chosen to do that. Almost always the surviving spouse has chosen to treat the inherited NQDA as her own. A non-spouse beneficiary has two choices, and that is to either liquidate the NQDA at the end of the 5th year after the owner's death, or stretch based on life expectancy beginning with the year after death. And the calculations made in the same way as it would be made for an inherited IRA. One other thing to note for an inherited NQDA is that there is no required beginning date for a non-qualified annuity. Therefore, the rules that are in the left box are the same no matter what age the non-qualified annuity account owner was at the time of death. And so in that way, things are easier to understand. For a non-qualified annuity, for a non-spouse, we've got 5-year liquidation or stretch based on life expectancy. And surviving spouse has generally the same kind of choices that she would have with regard to an inherited IRA or inherited qualified account, which in most cases means she's going to choose to treat the account as her own. Now, what happens if we've got a trust or estate as beneficiary of a non-qualified annuity? Apparently, and this is what the tax code says, we've got a 5-year liquidation deadline, and that is the only choice if we've got a trust or estate as the beneficiary. Now, not everybody 100% agrees with that. Some IRA custodians believe that the IRS, if they are ever asked the question, will allow for look-through trust treatment for an inherited NQDA if a trust is the beneficiary, if a look-through trust is the beneficiary. That is, that the trustee will be able to stretch based on the age of the oldest beneficiary of the trust. Some custodians believe that. The IRS has not said that straight out, and so those of us who are more conservative don't really put any stock in that belief, but you should be aware that some carriers out there believe that that's a possibility, and so it's something for you to keep in mind. All right, so that's pre-secure for qualified accounts, post-secure for qualified accounts, rules for inherited NQDAs, and now let's talk about twice inherited accounts. How does that work? Whether we've got a non-qualified annuity or a qualified account, for a twice inherited account in general, the successor beneficiary must finish the stretch option that was begun by the first beneficiary. So if we've got an inherited NQDA where the first beneficiary was stretching based on life expectancy, the next beneficiary after the first beneficiary's death continues the stretch that the first beneficiary started. For a qualified account, the successor beneficiary also finishes the stretch option that was begun by the first beneficiary. There is an additional requirement, and this is explicit as part of the Secure Act, that the second beneficiary can't take any longer than 10 years after the death of the first beneficiary to completely liquidate the account. So the twice inherited IRA or twice inherited qualified account or twice inherited non-qualified deferred annuity rules are pretty simple, which is that you finish what the first beneficiary started. And the only difference is that for a qualified account, there's an absolute 10-year liquidation deadline after the death of the first beneficiary. So I know that's a lot to try to keep straight. This webinar will be online, and if you ask for the materials associated with today's webinar, you'll get a copy of a recent Think About It article that we did, and the Think About It article has the charts in it that talk about the options for the various kinds of beneficiaries in the various categories. And you can see how those charts look here on the slide that's right in front of you. Also, you can see the rules not only for qualified accounts, but for inherited NQDA stretch and also twice inherited accounts. You can have it as an easy reference for you so that you can answer the kinds of questions that your clients might pose to you. So what are the takeaways that I wish you'd pull from today's session? First of all, surviving spouse stretch rules have hardly changed as a result of the Secure Act. If there is an EDB in the mix, certain creative stretch options may be available. We didn't talk about that much, but naming a trust as beneficiary, if there is an eligible designated beneficiary in the family who is also a beneficiary of the trust, we may be able to retain certain kinds of lifetime stretch rules based on the age of the oldest beneficiary of the trust. So that kind of planning may be available and should be thought about. Inherited NQDAs were unaffected by the Secure Act's changes. And if you don't know it already, I will say this out loud: stretch rules are hard. If you understand them well, you can differentiate yourself from other professionals. And then, you know, from a sales perspective, we've got a shorter stretch duration for most non-spouse beneficiaries of qualified accounts. To me, that's an opportunity to talk to clients about life insurance to cover the income tax exposure that their beneficiaries will have when they liquidate the inherited qualified accounts. I'd like to thank you again for attending today's webinar. Feel welcome to pass word along to other financial professionals that you think could benefit from the content that we provide. And let me turn the program back over to Amber to wrap us up. Amber?
Thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, if you would like to receive supporting materials, feel welcome to email us at asktheexpert@advancedunderwriting.com. You may also email questions related to today's webinar. Feel welcome to join us for the next webinar on the first Wednesday of next month, September 6th, at this same time. Next month's webinar will be titled Using UTMA. You can also find an archive of past webinars on our YouTube channel, Advanced Underwriting Consultants. Please subscribe to our channel. It helps us to keep making free webinar content. Today's presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel by the end of this week. Finally, for more information about the services that Advanced Underwriting Consultants offer, including phone consultation and newsletter licensing, feel welcome to contact us at 615-224-1291. That's 615-224-1291. Thanks again and best wishes for continued success.